Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it very much. Thank you to Steve. And let's just begin. I'm sort of still kind of under the influence of that film as a mother of two little boys. I was listening to the Prime Minister, and I was listening to the French ambassador, and to the other ministers who came here this morning. And it reminded me, everybody talking and sharing the same perspective on the massacres in Paris on Friday night, that this was an attack against us all, that this was an attack on humanity, on civilization, and unfortunately a direct attack on all of the people who were massacred, going about their lives in Paris, and what it really means, the kind of toll that terrorism takes. And I have to admit that lurking in the back of my mind, and I think in the back of a lot of Israelis' mind, was a lingering question that has bothered us each time there were mass terror attacks, beginning perhaps in Madrid, London, in 2005, and ever since, which is, do they get it now? Do they understand? Here we are, the nation of Israel, so many of us putting the tricolor on our Facebook pages, and thousands of Israelis participating in vigils and in really sort of these ceremonies where we come together to express our revulsion at what happened to the young people in Paris on Friday night. And the question always lurking in our brains, even if we don't mention it out loud, is, do they get it? Do they understand? In fact, the day that the terrorist bombings took place in London in 2005, I wrote a column for the Jerusalem Post that appeared the next day, which I called An Attack on Us All, an attack against us all. And in it, I described how the British governments had been acting in a very clear way from a political perspective under Tony Blair and subsequent to that, to make a distinction between Palestinian terrorism against Israel and terrorism against the rest of the world, and Islamic terrorism against the rest of the world, and wondering whether now that they have suffered the same fate as Israelis suffer every day, whether they would finally understand that terrorism, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, is indivisible. Well, a decade passed since those terrorist bombings in London, and the distinction that Europeans in particular make on the ground, regardless of their declarations immediately after terrorist bombings, between the murder of Israelis at the hands of Palestinian terrorists and the murder of foreigners at the hands of terrorists has only grown. The discrimination against Israel, the hands particularly of Europeans, and the distinction that they make between Israel and their countries and the rest of the countries of the world has only been exacerbated, has only escalated, has only grown much worse. And I think that in the question itself is a hope that the discrimination that Israelis have experienced at the hand particularly of European governments, that discrimination is based on a lack of awareness, on an ignorance of what's happening, of the ignorance of what jihad is, and an ignorance of what it is that fuels terrorism. But unfortunately, and that as a result, once that ignorance is rectified, once people learn for themselves what it means, they will treat us in the same manner with which they would like us and expect us to treat them, and the way that they treat one another. Unfortunately, the reason why that never happens is because the distinct relationship that they have with Israel, the distinct way that they have of treating us, is not based upon a lack of experience. It's prejudice, not facts, that stand at the heart of the bum deal that Israel has repeatedly received from Europe. It's because of facts, and when the facts don't match that prejudice we see here on the ground every day, and we have with increasing urgency or expansiveness on every single day that Europe is spending millions of euros every single year, year in, year out, funding anti-Israel organizations here, registered as non-governmental organizations, whose task is to distort facts or invent facts in order to align with the prejudicial view that Europeans hold of Israel. We don't abuse human rights. We don't break international law. And yet we see an army of NGOs every single day putting out more and more reports claiming the opposite is true, claiming that black is white and white is black. Now, why is this? It's because that action on the part of the governments of Europe, the funding of these lies, of this distortion of reality, advances a policy that we never hear discussed openly, but is clear as day, which is to discriminate against the Jewish state in order to weaken and harm it. And again, Israel enacts this policy by using legal forums, trade forums, and political forums. Today, we are in the midst of Europe's trade war against Israel. The war itself, the existence of this trade war that Europe is waging against us is hidden. It's never acknowledged. It is hidden by lies about international law, lies about consumer protection, and lies about human rights. But the war itself is a breach of international law. It doesn't protect consumers, and it harms human rights. The EU's new labeling guidelines for Israeli products produced beyond the 1949s are precisely what they appear to be. They are a new set of rules that apply only to the Jewish state and to our detriment. That's all. They do not exist for anybody else, only for Israel. Now, what do these labels say? Do they say product of the West Bank? No. Do they say product of Judea and Samaria? No. They say that products produced beyond the 1949 armistice lines by Jews are products of Israeli settlements. Not same labels that they use for products produced by non-Jews in those areas, only Jews. And the interesting thing is both the distinctiveness of the labeling and the fact that it isn't only the place of origin, but who produces them. Now, European officials argue that the purpose of these labels is not to harm Israel, but simply to protect consumers. But if they aren't directed against Israel, then it isn't possible to argue that consumers have been harmed by the use of the labels made in Israel. And if consumers have been harmed by the fact that Israeli products produced beyond the 1949 armistice lines have been labeled to date made in Israel, then that means that this is a policy that's directed against Israel. That Israel has been doing something wrong for which it must be punished, because apparently the Europeans believe that if consumers aren't told that Israelis operating beyond the 1949 armistice lines are producing these products, then they won't know not to buy them. And what they have to learn is not to buy them, and therefore they're told not only that it's made in the West Bank, not only that it's made in Judea and Samaria, but it's made by Israelis. Now, the Europeans, including the Honorable Ambassador to the UN, who will speak after me, argue that these aren't substantive issues. They are technical issues. And they're right. They are technical issues. They are technical barriers to trade, and as such, they are illegal under international law. Under the WTO treaties, it is illegal to introduce technical barriers to trade among trading partners, signatory nations of the WTO projects. Now, if they want to continue with these labels and not be in breach of binding international law, then they can leave the WTO. Or, alternatively, they can remain in the WTO and use the same labels against everybody in the same legal situation. Meaning, for instance, that instead of insisting that products produced in Western Sahara are produced in Morocco, they will label that they are settlement products They are Moroccan settlement products from Western Sahara. Now, they're not going to pull out of the WTO, and they're not going to apply this new rule equitably across the board to everybody because they don't care about this issue when it applies to anybody else. They only care about it in regards to Israel because their policy towards Israel, again, is to discriminate against Israel in order to harm it. Now, this isn't the first time that this has happened to us. This isn't the first time that we have been singled out for unique treatment by the Europeans, and it won't be the last one. But we have to understand that it isn't simply a question of wanting to make it about technical issues. This is part and parcel of an overall policy whose purpose is to harm the Jewish state. And why do they want to harm us? Because they don't want to treat us the same way that they treat everybody else. They don't think that we deserve to be treated the same way as every other country in the world, let alone every other liberal democracy in the world.